Okay, we are live. I'm just going to run through some housekeeping just quickly while people join. So Dean's going to talk for about 25, 30 minutes, and then we've got about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So any comments or questions as we go through, just pop them in the chat, and then I'll ask Dean those at the end. If for any reason we can't get through everyone's questions, we'll answer them afterwards, and we will share answers with everybody. We're also going to record this, so I'll share the recording with everybody as well afterwards. And then the last bit, I've popped a Slido link in the comments. Dean's got 3 questions that he's going to ask as we go through. All those 3 questions will be on that Slido link. If you click on it now, it's blank. I promise you it's the right link. We're just going to surface the questions as we go through rather than having them there the whole time. So yeah, I think that's probably it for housekeeping. Just to introduce Dean properly, I do have his official bio, which I will read, but just my personal introduction first. I'm super grateful for Dean for this presentation, but just in general, we met in Canada a couple of years ago when Dean was speaking at an event then, and he's just so incredibly passionate about what he does and so willing to share that I think after that event, I just bothered him every time I had a question or I wanted to have a geek out about something HR or TA, and he always had time, always had something incredible to share. So I know this morning is going to be awesome and I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm very grateful for Dean in general. In terms of the official bio, for the last decade, Dean has been focused on talent management and creating frameworks of equity for organizations. Through his consultancy, he has helped organizations design strategic frameworks focused on diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity. Dean is also a professor and program lead of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workplace program at George Brown College, and is a global conference speaker, delivering talks and workshops to students and industry professionals. Dean's also got a master's in human resource management and is currently studying his PhD. So if anybody wants a PhD geek out at the end, then I'm sure Dean's got time for that too. I think that's probably enough for me. I'll hand over to Dean.
Oh my gosh. Well, Laura, listen, this is just absolutely fantastic. I'm so excited to honestly be here. And I've got to say, I've had the opportunity to know you, Laura, for the last couple of years, and it's just been absolutely wonderful. And I'm so appreciative of you and the work that you're doing with Striven. And so I'm so grateful just to be here on the other side of the world with you and with everybody that's here with us, to this morning. And, I'll start off by saying that this conversation that we're going to have around diversity inclusion, I think it's really here to give you a real healthy foundation, especially for anyone who's really passionate and interested in this work, or even if you just want to learn more because you just really don't know. And I completely understand where you're coming from. And so hopefully by the end of it, you gain, enough knowledge for you to really start your journey around inclusion and equity, whether it's in your workplace, your community, or wherever you um, decide to do that work in. Before I start, it's always important for me to acknowledge the territory that I'm on, and I'll be completely transparent. I was mentioning to Laura a little bit earlier that I'm not in the place I normally reside, Toronto, right now, but it's important for me to always read a land acknowledgement that represents the land that I settle on. And for you who are not used to hearing land acknowledgements, I recognize, because I am from the Toronto area in Canada, that I'm a settler to the lands in Canada. And because I understand that I'm a settler to the lands in Canada, and the people of Indigenous descent are the first caretakers, I like to read land acknowledgements because it brings for me the opportunity to bring reconciliation and healing, particularly to those who have been marginalized from Indigenous heritage. So I'm going to read this, representing the land that I'm from. It says, we are on the traditional territory of the Many Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit and Métis people. Toronto, it's covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Now, I also know that Australia, and if you're from other parts of the world, may have been originally founded by Indigenous people. And if you know the land that you're on, you can always feel free to put that in the chat and let us know. If you don't know, it's completely fine. But I typically like to encourage people that when we acknowledge that you might be on a different territory, there's a website that's called nativeland.ca, and it actually doesn't cover just lands in Canada, but it covers lands across the world. And so you can always feel free to go to that website. You might be able to see what land you might be situated on. And for me, I just want to, extend my respect to all First Nations and Inuit people for their contributions to not just Canada, but to the whole world. And so I really appreciate all of you for allowing me to share that, as it's really, really important to me to acknowledge the land that I'm on. So in this agenda today, we're going to talk about a couple of things. First of all, the current climate, meaning kind of what's happening in our world today, dimensions of diversity. I really want to give you some theoretical explanation to what diversity really means. We're going to talk about bias a bit, right? Because you've been hearing this word bias kind of been thrown around, and I want to give you a little understanding as to why that's important. And then I want to talk to you a little bit more about organizational goals and what I call personal goals. And so let's get started. If you think about it logically, our world has been experiencing things like never before. Like, let's talk first, a global pandemic that's rocked our world. And, a lot of the world is still coming out of the pandemic, and maybe it's affected you personally, or you might have known somebody that has been affected by this pandemic in different ways other than just being sick. But other than that, we've also been experiencing a rise in social justice around our world due to the death of many people, particularly in the US, but also in different parts of our world. One name that rings true, I think, now internationally is the murder of George Floyd and what happened to him, which really, really sparked conversations, not just in communities or institutions and in policy, but it also sparked lots of conversation within workplaces. But it doesn't just affect one identity group. I mean, think about this statement that I'm going to read. It's from the Asian American Pacific Islander, and I'm reading this for a reason. You'll see in a minute. It says, "I was in line at the pharmacy when a woman sprayed Lysol all over me, and she was yelling out, 'You're the infection. Go home. We don't want you here.'" Now, when I think about this, that another human being could speak to another human being in such a fashion, I personally think, oh my gosh, that's absolutely deplorable. Does this really happen close to home? Because I'm reading something that's based out of the US, but this is not just something that's a US problem. I was doing some studying, some research, and I was thinking about the racism and discrimination that people face all across the world. I want to read something to you, if that's okay. An individual by the name of Anthony, who um, is Asian, he wrote this. He said, "I was playing cricket earlier this year, and I was standing at the crease waiting for a ball when he heard a member of the opposite team repeatedly call out coronavirus." And hearing that, he kind of, stumbled. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, Dean, where in the world was that? Can I tell you where it was? It was right here at home in Australia where he experienced that. And, a survey was done that said over 84% of Asian Australians have faced discrimination over the last year. But you know what really hit me about this story even more? It wasn't just that he had experienced that form of discrimination based upon who he was and his identity, but what really hit me is that his team members stood around and said absolutely nothing. And so this issue is not just a North American thing. This is a global problem that affects all of us. You and I have probably seen images like this. People saying that they would like to stand in solidarity with Indigenous Australians. If you understand the research behind discrimination that Indigenous Australians face, you'll see that they're 13 times more likely, above their population growth, to be imprisoned, discriminated against in so many different ways. And so this is not a problem that one group is facing in our world, but several groups are experiencing different issues when it comes to discrimination. And so you've got to think about your work colleagues and think about what they must be going through on the job. Have you ever personally thought about how systemic discrimination might affect your colleagues? For example, have you ever been questioned or told you're so articulate um, for someone who comes from another country? You ever been told that? Mm. Have you ever experienced maybe racial or sexist remarks about who you are or your identity at work? I was watching this YouTube video of this from this Black identifying Australian who she speaks actually, quite quietly, but she is an Australian. And she was talking about when she was younger and she was working as a waitress and she was serving a table, how the individual at the table started to yell at her, saying, "Speak up. I can't understand your accent. I can't understand you. I can't understand where you're from. Go get me somebody else who can help me." And she ran back to the back crying. Have you ever faced that? Have you ever dealt with that about at work, basically being receiving complaints just about how you speak, even though you are from that native country? How about this? I'm currently right now, I was mentioning to Laura, in Orlando, the home of Disney World. Have you ever faced this? Have you ever been in a room with a CEO and that CEO look at you and say, "Hey, You know, I noticed when my family went to Disney World that there was no Black people around. Is that because they're poor?" Now, you might be wondering what CEO would ever say something like that. Well, if you don't believe that's really real, it actually happened to me, where a CEO I personally used to work for looked at me and asked me, even though the conversation had nothing to do with Disney World, said, "Oh, Dean, I went to Disney World with my family and noticed there was no Black people. Is it because Black people are poor?" My friends, this is not something that's just in the outside world, but it's happening in our workplaces even now. And so I'd love to ask you all a question. And Laura's going to help me because I want to just get your thoughts. I want to get your opinion. I want you to participate. And I'm going to ask you a question where I want you to put a word in to create a word cloud in our Slido poll. And so Laura's going to actually give you the Slido number that you can go to. And then I want you actually to help me participate in this. And here's the question that I want to ask you, if you would help me with our Slido poll for a quick moment, which says, what is one word describing how you were feeling after you heard about circumstances involving racism and discrimination around our world? What is one word describing how you were feeling after you heard about circumstances involving racism and discrimination around our world? Laura, do you need to give any instructions or are you okay?
I've just put the link in the chat, and I think people are just starting to cast their votes now.
All right. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Some people are saying the word anger. Some people are using the term relatable. Really, really, really appreciate that. As you are kind of putting in words or populating kind of your thoughts around this, I personally remember, when George Floyd was murdered. And I remember for me, when I had seen it in the media, you know, the first actual reaction I had was not anger and it wasn't frustration or it wasn't, feeling like I could relate to it. You know what it really was? It was the word desensitization. It was feeling numb. Maybe some of you are kind of wondering, like, why would you even feel numb about that circumstance? Aren't you angry? Aren't you mad? Well, the reason why I use that term numb is because for me, I've seen it so many times. It's almost like a Hollywood movie on replay, seeing all of these different things. And I remember I was on a call that week with some North American diversity leaders. I remember they specifically said, let's put the elephant in the room. Let's talk about what happened. And I was one of two Black males on that call. And I remember when they had asked me how I was feeling, all of a sudden I started to feel all this anger and all this frustration. And, Canadians were so used to be known as being really, really nice. And I realized for myself, I had masked my emotions of all these things that are happening to be professional, to live the status quo, to be nice, not realizing that me personally, I have all of these emotions that I'm feeling. And I feel the same way as many of you, disgusted, disheartened, infuriated, shame, helpless, frustrated. And I see exactly where you're coming from, and I really appreciate it. And I think we sometimes need a place where we can share our emotions. So I just want to say thank you so much for participating with that word cloud. It really means a lot. And a little bit later, I'm also gonna ask you a couple questions where I'm gonna ask you to participate in some polls. And so keep that Slido number handy. It's gonna be important. So let's really kind of reason it out, because I think it's really, really important when we think about it. We got to ask why. Like, why do humans make stereotypical or prejudicial judgments, right, about others? How does that actually lead to discrimination? Why does our brains, what is it in our minds that makes assessments about the world around us? How does our minds make classifications and judgments about our world? These are questions that we have to understand. As humans, it's natural for us to group people into categories that we organically side with, right? And it's easy for us to make unintentional judgments about other groups. And sometimes we can even be in favor of those groups or against those groups. And what that is really, really called is bias. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we get to really, really diving into bias, I feel like I need to define what diversity inclusion really means so we understand theoretically what it means. Diversity, when we think about it, it's the unique characteristics that make all of us up as individuals, as people, as human beings. And so I'm going to say something that's going to sound a little bit challenging, particularly to those that are really, understand or in this diversity space. But please listen and hear me out for a minute. Don't cut me off. A lot of times when we think about diversity, we think of it as an us versus them. And the them in the diversity equation is typically the straight, white, able bodied male. But can I be quite honest with you and very transparent? That even the straight, able bodied white male has characteristics and elements of diversity that we may not consider visual diversity, but has elements of diversity. So the reality is that when we talk about diversity, this is a conversation that's not an us versus them. It's about all of us together. And that's really important. And what we want to see, particularly in our workspaces, is we want to see everybody from all walks of life come and work in our workspaces where they can come, be their whole self, do their best work, and feel included, where they don't have to feel like they have to hide any part of themselves, but they can come in and perform to the best of their ability. And in that place where people feel psychologically safe, where they feel that they trust their organization, where they feel that they can do their best work, that is the place of where we call belonging. And so there was a research study by an organization called Better Up, where in that research study, they did what we call an employer NPS score, Net Promoter Score, to find out how employees feel around how employees feel in organizations where they belong. Here's what they discovered. They discovered that employees that feel a sense of belonging in organizations are 167% more likely to promote their organization above people who don't feel like they belong. So for you who are in talent or in recruitment or in HR on this call, your best recruitment strategy is to ensure that people feel a sense of belonging, because they're the ones who are going to promote your organization. And the question that we are talking about in our world really, though, is this question of equity. Because the reality is even though we all have characteristics of diversity, there are some individuals in society who have greater advantage over others based upon who they are from an identity perspective, leaving others marginalized. And that's a lot of the conversation that we're really going to talk about today. And so I talk about this question about intersectionality because I like to break it down so that people really understand what I mean when I talk about diversity. And I'm going to use myself as an example. So, from a sex perspective, I'd be considered a biological male. From a gender perspective, I would consider myself a straight man. From a religious perspective, I'd consider myself a person of faith. From an age perspective, I mean, I'm more middle aged now. I mean, I want to be younger, but that could be a bias too, right? From a disability perspective, right? I actually have a physical disability that you can't see, but I actually have one, believe it or not. But here's where it gets interesting. From an ethnicity perspective, I was born and raised in Toronto, right? And racially, I identify as Black, but my mom is Jamaican, beautiful island in the Caribbean, and my dad is from an island called St. Vincent in the Caribbean. But his family background is Portuguese. And you would never know his family background is Portuguese unless I told you. So my last name, Del Peach, is actually originally Del Pesh, which probably meant the fishers. But when my dad moved to the UK, the place of Laura's origin, he actually the government changed his name to an English sounding name. So there's only a couple Del Peaches in the world, believe it or not. What am I saying? That unless you actually speak to someone and understand who they are, you would never know all the characteristics of diversity that they actually represent. And so it comes back to our definition of bias, right? Where we have the ability at times to prejudice people in favor whether in favor of one distinction or another, or we favor different people over others, right? And so a lot of times when we think about bias, we do think of it in a negative light, but sometimes it could actually be seen in a positive way too. When you were born, up until about 5 years old, your parents, your guardians, your environment have shaped the person that you are today. And so, because they have shaped that, it's given you your perspective in the world. And so, for example, I'll use one of my intersectionalities, disability. If you are on the playground and you heard that someone on the playground had a disability, maybe you grew up thinking that people with disabilities cannot perform as well as others on the playground. So you might have excluded someone from playing with you because maybe you didn't think that they'd be the best team member. Fast forward to where you are today, maybe you've changed your mindset around um, people with disabilities. But when you are interviewing someone in the workplace as a hiring manager or an HR, and one of your selections, or the people you're selecting, might have a disability, you might choose the other three people in the pool versus this person, thinking, "Oh, I really need someone who's going to be more agile, or could really work better on the project," not realizing that that person with a disability, as long as they have the right accommodation, can be either as effective or even more effective. And a lot of the reason we do that is because we have what's called unconscious bias, implicit bias. So a lot of the bias that we talk about, it's under the surface, it's not as overt, and it plays out in different ways. And so let's look at an example of how it could play out. So number one, what we typically like to do is we like to stereotype groups. We like to generalize groups, right? And assign identical characteristics to people in a group. All Black people are like this. That's what we like to do. And then what we typically will do is in that group, we assign prejudice. And sometimes prejudice can be positive or negative. Black people are great athletes, sounds like a positive. Or we could say Black people are criminals. I'm using Black just because I identify as Black and I'm comfortable with doing that, right? So we get negative or positive emotions and judgments about our attitudes towards the groups we stereotype. But then, right, once we begin to actually treat people in an unjust way, that's where we get discrimination. And discrimination can happen based on grounds such as race, age, all different grounds. So all of us can face discrimination. So let's see how it actually plays out. So think about this for stereotyping. And I apologize if you may not be able to read the bottom of my slides clear. It's just the way of the formatting. But let's look at stereotyping, a belief we have about a group or an institution or an individual. So let's look at this example. In our sales department, Men appear to be better candidates than women because they are better at building rapport and making clients comfortable. So let's look at the prejudice, right? Which is a positive or negative emotion. In Mary's interview, she seemed too formal and uptight, even though she has the skills. Not sure she'll work well with our clients. John and I built a rapport so quickly because we both play golf, and I think you'd be a better fit, right? These are real conversations that happen in real life. Now let's look at the discrimination. I would rather hire John because he'll make a better fit for our clients. Believe it or not, that is how the mind works, and that is how bias shows up in our workspaces. And then it comes out into what we call systemic or institutional discrimination, right? Which is a form of discrimination and racism that we see happen in social and political institutions. We see it reflected in disparities. I talked about indigenous aboriginals in jail or in the criminal justice system proportionally 13 times higher. But it also happens in wealth, income, and in employment. It happens in our workspaces. And then it helps us to understand that some people have greater advantage. We call that privilege. It's just greater advantage. All of us have privilege, believe it or not, who are on this call. But there's some, based upon who they are, they just have greater advantage. Oh, I have a gut feeling that John is just going to be just a better person because he plays golf. What? What does golf have to do with the job? That's what we're talking about. Some people have greater advantage. And so I want to show you this slide. And I want you to think with me. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you see this slide? Now, you can't type in the chat, may not be able to type in the chat, and I see your answers, but it's okay. I want you to think in your mind, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you see a slide? Maybe you see a nice bike. Maybe you see a nice housing complex. Maybe you're like, oh, handsome guy, right? Maybe you're like, oh, nice car, right? Maybe all of us have different ways of how we see a picture. But let me explain what this picture is. This is Christian Mambaza. He is a grade 7 school teacher. And one day in his beautiful neighborhood, he was going to his car to grab something to go for his bike ride. He wasn't able to get into his car because he has one of those remote starter devices on his phone. It just wasn't working. But he was just standing outside there and trying to get into his car where someone from the neighborhood took a video of him trying to get into his car. And the neighbor takes the video, puts it on their community Facebook group, and says the following words: lock your doors, just saw this happening in our neighborhood, make sure you're safe out there. Basically alluding to the fact that Christian, who's lived in this area for a long time, was a thief and a criminal. So guess what happened? A lot of people who knew Christian started to see the post and started to say, no, that's wrong. Christian's a great, upstanding person in our society, fantastic person, no, blah, blah, blah. And eventually that post was taken down. But what Christian said was something was really interesting. He was so thankful for the people that really, really supported him. But what he said was this. He said, even though people, had supported me, this is not an isolated incident, meaning that it's not something that hasn't happened before because he's experienced this just for being the person who he is. So what am I saying today? That all of us could see this photo and see Christian in so many different lights, but someone sees him as a thief. So interesting. And so why does this matter? Why do we even care? Why are we even talking about this? And I'll only spend about a couple more minutes with you on the conversation, but it matters because everybody deserves to feel valued. Everybody. Believe it or not, me and Laura at some point in time could never be friends just because of the way I looked. But I'm so grateful that there are people who have pressed on the road just so that all of us could feel valued. And that's the reason why you're on this call today. It's not because this was a great this was designed to be a great presentation. No, because Australia needs change makers like you. Australia needs people who can really, really speak to inclusion and equity and really support the fact that everybody matters and everybody deserves to feel valued. Now, I'm just going to skip this these two slides just because of time, but I want to just quickly talk to you about what organizations are doing now, because I think this is really, really important. How do we really affect and make change? Well, let's start with this first, right? We've got to implement diversity and inclusion strategies. This is not about just putting up an employment resource group at our companies or celebrating Black History Month or Australia Day or whatever it is. No, we need actual strategies and roadmaps in our organizations that we can action plan on. We need greater education and training. And that's why I'm so grateful for people like Laura, and I'm so grateful for Striving, because Laura just wants to see people educated in so many different capacities. And that's what we need to see happen. We need equitable recruitment solutions and compensation solutions, right? Why should I, who have the exact same amount of experience as you, be making $20,000 to $30,000 less in the same company? Doesn't make any sense. We need equitable solutions. We need equitable recruitment solutions, so we're not just hiring based on nepotism or friends or people that look like us, but we're hiring people who are skilled and qualified from all walks of life. And we need greater accountability, greater governance and policy and implementation changes within our organizations. And we can always talk more about that offline, and how we can do that. But this is what we're starting to see organizations start to do. But the next question that I have to ask as we wrap up this conversation is, what can you do? What can you personally do to actually be a part of the change today? Well, let me tell you, number one, recognize your own personal bias. We all have them, every single one of us. We look at groups in different ways and have different negative forms of bias towards different groups. All we need to start doing is recognize our personal bias, understand where it comes from. Why do I think like this? Why do I think about groups in this fashion? And let's start working towards making changes towards what I call cultural awareness. And that happens through personal education. You know, when this call is done, there's a couple people that might be like, hey, that was a great conversation. Great job, Laura. Thanks for bringing in Dean. Maybe some others might be like, oh, I didn't like it, whatever. All right. But listen to what I'm going to say to you. In 2 weeks from now, you're going to forget about every single thing I said, unless you make a commitment today to say, I'm going to actually start personally educating myself. I'm going to watch a YouTube video. I'm going to read an article. I want to learn more. I'm going to read a book on inclusive conversations. I want to learn more about what I can do to personally start to make those changes in my life. What about inclusive language? You know, in Canada, there's a word that people a lot of times like to use, and I don't know if they use it in Australia, but it's a word called powwow. And it's an indigenous, it's a word that represents indigenous celebration. And a lot of times people use it in the context of, gathering together in team meetings, but it's really being used out of context. And the thing is that that word has sacred meaning for indigenous people. It's a real celebration. So learning to curb maybe different words that you've used in the past to say, you know what, I'm not going to really use that anymore. Instead of saying powwow, I'm just going to say team meeting, or, everybody, let's get together. Point being, let's look at how we speak one to another, and let's use language that's more welcoming, respectful, valuing the other person, who they are and their identity. What about active listening and empathy? I'll tell you a quick story, and then I'll go to accountability, and then we're going to wrap up. And then Laura, you're going to put up our final poll, if that's okay. Active listening. I remember I was in a call, and it was actually in the month of June 2 years ago, during Pride Month. And there was an individual who was from the LGBTQ community on the call, and her name was Joanne. She said, and she was talking about, how at work she feels like she belongs, she feels included. She could talk about her family, her partner, her weekends, etc. But then she said something really interesting. She said, but I hate coming to work on Mondays. And we're like, what? What are you talking about? You hate coming to work on Mondays. You just told us you like your workplace. She said, well, the reason I don't like coming to work on Mondays is because I don't like client calls. I'm client facing, and I don't like client calls on Mondays. And the reason I don't like it is because I don't like when they ask me about my weekend, because I'm uncomfortable sharing that part of who I am with my clients, because I don't want anyone in my company to feel disrespected. And I really don't like when I have another colleague on the call, because I don't want them to feel ashamed of me talking about who I am and, my weekends and my relationships, etc. You know what? I would never have known that unless I had the opportunity to be there to listen. My whole point being is that by listening to people's stories, you can help people navigate their workplaces and make real supportive changes. And finally, accountability. We could talk about this all day long, but if we're not keeping ourselves and others accountable and helping others to really on this journey, right, then we're not really doing much. So I encourage you to really ensure that you're being accountable to the information that you're receiving and that you're helping others along the journey with you. And so with that said, as I end up this presentation, I want to ask you this last question. And Laura's going to put up the Slido for us. You have the number. I'd love for you to go in. What is one tangible action that you will implement to reduce bias and improve equity and inclusion? What is one tangible action that you will do personally after this call to reduce bias and improve equity and inclusion? Oh, wow. All right. Well, listen, I mean, so far the poll has started off well with people saying that they're going to do as much as they can to reduce equity and inclusion. And feel free to continue to put in your thoughts. I'm going to wrap up here by saying thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to present. And I'm going to hand it back to Laura. Feel free to continue to put in your poll. I'm just so grateful to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. It was amazing, honestly. And just your enthusiasm for it as well. I feel like everybody got really G'd up and all the comments and everything have been awesome. So thank you for everyone putting comments in as well. We've had one question from Cam I'm going to start with, but if anyone else has got questions, feel free to jump in with them. So Cam's asked, and I'm going to read it so I don't miss anything. Timothy R. Clark refers to junk theories of superiority in his book, The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, and in his definition of the first stage, inclusion safety, that in order to achieve this, we need to embrace worth over worthiness, i.e. our status as humans earns us the right to be treated equally. So how do we break the stereotypes and raise awareness of the biases?
Yeah, it's a big question, but I actually know Timothy. I know that individual. I know exactly what you're talking about. I know those 4 stages, so it's interesting that you brought that up. Yeah, if you really want to, so I think that the first question is, can you eliminate bias? No, and you don't even want to, believe it or not, because as I said, bias helps you navigate your world around you. It actually can help to keep you safe, right? So it's not about eliminating bias, but it's about reducing negative stereotypes and connotations towards groups based upon truth versus what I call myth. And so here's how you do it. I'm going to give you some steps real quick, right? I actually teach about managing implicit bias, but I'll give you some quick steps. So let's take a group of people who are standing with hoodies on. I grew up in a place called Scarborough in Toronto in Canada, and there's some really kind of negative pockets, and my experiences are sometimes when you have people with hoodies on, right, standing together, they're doing some form of criminal activity. That's my experiences, and that's a bias I have. So let's see how I deconstruct that. So number one, I've got to acknowledge I have that bias. What if those 4 people who stood up with hoodies on were just cold? Maybe they're not doing criminal activity. So I got to understand, what's the root of that? Where does it come from? Well, it comes from my past. It comes from my experiences. It comes from the life I live. So if I acknowledge, number one, that that's an issue, I know where the root of it comes from, then I've got to personally just say that is a bias. I got to confess it to myself. I got to say this is something that I personally deal with. And then what I need to do is I need to start to say, okay, how do I make steps toward what I call cultural awareness? So if you know you have biases towards certain groups, begin to start to do some research on those groups, understand those groups, understand information about those groups. That's what we call making steps toward cultural awareness, because once you start to understand, you start to actually realize a couple of things. Number one, because we all have elements of diversity, it starts to make you empathetic that, hey, I could personally be stereotyped, right, for things that I didn't even realize. Why should I be stereotyping those groups based upon those things? And then as you begin to do that and make those steps toward culture awareness, it begins to help you open up what we call your in-group. Because we always usually side with the people we're closest to. It begins for you to open up and begin to say, hey, let me start to welcome other people in. And so there's actual steps toward reducing bias towards groups. And those are some steps that you can take.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. There's been loads of comments in the chat, so you'll have to read through those afterwards. But basically, everyone thinks you're amazing. So thanks, Dean. I have one question that I was going to ask. So you brought up about personal education earlier, and I think like anything, right? We can all put it in Google, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes up. But have you got any kind of go-to books, articles, whatever, that are a really great place for people to start around personal education?
Yeah. So there's quite a bit of different books, and we can always talk about resources at any time. And Laura is going to share my contact information. Feel free to reach out. But a book that I've been reading is a book called Inclusive Conversations by Mary Frances Winter. Mary Frances Winter is a diversity inclusion specialist in the U.S. and but has been just doing it for a long time. So she's a wealth of information and a lot of knowledge, a lot of examples. And it's really just a good help tool to help you to start to have conversations with people, considering who they are as people and valuing them as individuals. And I think that's a really, 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 a good book that I'm currently sharing with people. But there's lots of resources on different topics, and it really just depends on what you want to learn. Believe it or not, and I'm going to be honest, even YouTube. If you type in something in YouTube, obviously there's things you got to weed around, but even just listening to some of the speakers and people on YouTube and different TED Talks, it opens up your mind. So I think that's really, really good. There's one Australian, though, that I want to make mention of that I really follow, Juliet Bork. And she was a partner with Deloitte. She was behind the inclusive leadership model that Deloitte put out. And I encourage you to read some of her work. I don't necessarily, she has a lot of opinions about certain things, and I might not side with all her opinions, but at the same time, I think she's someone that I definitely, look to as someone who's done great research. So that's another person.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for that. I've popped your bio, so for anybody that wants to get in touch with Dean, I've put his LinkedIn profile in the comments, so feel free to reach out. Or if you need anything as well, feel free to email me as well. Thank you all for your time today, and thank you, Dean. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Laura, and I'm so glad to be included, and so good to be with all of you.